I'm going to show you 25 ways to play the Scandinavian as black in 2025, so that whichever way you like to play chess, whatever your style may be, you will find the way of playing the Scandinavian that fits best for you. So let's dive right in. The first way of playing the Scandinavian is to play it not by taking the pawn back immediately, we'll get to some of those ways later, but rather with playing this gambit of bishop g4, the Portuguese gambit. This is something I actually already covered in an earlier YouTube video of mine, my favorite gambit against 1e4, which I have included the link to as well, just as a suggested video, in case you want to check that one out. But that's the first way of playing the Scandinavian, the way of playing in a bit of a gambit kind of style, if you want to attack, get a lead in development, that kind of thing. Now, the second way to play the Scandinavian is to just take the pawn back with knight takes d5. And this line admittedly doesn't have the best reputation. Like, if you play it with, say, the normal old main lines of bishop g4 or g6, white does get a big advantage there with correct play. So if you're going to play this second way, I'd recommend playing it with bishop f5, which is a little bit less theoretical, but does allow you to get out of the opening with a reasonably solid position with no real theory entailed. So it's a bit of a kind of lazy approach to the Scandinavian. Also, if you are new to the channel, do make sure to subscribe, and also, if you're enjoying the video, just hit that like button. But the other ways we're going to see, nearly all of them are going to involve the move of queen takes d5, which can be played in a lot of different ways, it turns out. So after knight c3, we already have a pretty wide choice of options, and what you'll discover is even within these options, there are several sub-variations, just little tweaks we can make in order to make this opening our own. But we're going to start with the move of queen a5 as the most common one at the master level. And after d4, knight f6, and knight f3, this is a little bit of a tabia position, a branching point where black has a wide choice, and a lot of different ways that they can go. So the third way is to play this line known as the Lashnika system with bishop f5, which was actually my main recommendation in the Scandinavian back in 2020, and even for some years after that. And the idea of playing bishop f5 is basically that, one thing you have to watch out for when you play the queen a5 Scandinavian is that they don't have a move like knight d5 to discover an attack on your queen. And so this way free, the Lashnikov variation has the idea of playing bishop b4, where you're going to recycle that bishop if you need to for the knight, as a way to safeguard our king and get good counterattacking chances. It is something I do cover much, much more deeply in my course, Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025. It's not the first time I'm going to mention it in this video, but I've included a link in the description in case you do want to check that out. And it is my primary recommendation in that course, this Lashnika system, which I only discovered about 11 years ago from my Olympiad teammate, Australian gem David Smurden, who also happens to be a bit of a Scandinavian expert. He showed me this line. I kind of was very intrigued by it the first time I saw it. But anyway, the fourth way of playing the Scandinavian is, the sort of old main line way I'm going to call the fourth way, which is where you play c6. So you're keeping the options open as to where you're going to develop your bishop outside the pawn chain. So bishop c4, bishop f5, bishop d2. So way 4 is basically to go e6 here. And not be afraid of them playing knight d5 and discovering attack on the queen. And there's even like a couple of different like subways as such. Like if I wanted to make it even more, you could say that these are two different sort of options that you can go for, with gf6 being the one that, Hikaru Nakamura has kind of favored in blitz games of late. But the one that I recommend in my course is the move queen f6, where I do think white is struggling to prove an advantage as white. So just a little bit about how to play the fourth way, how to play the old main line of the entire Scandinavian complex. If you do want something a little bit more original, Wave 5 is what might come to your mind. And it's what I call the Soviet way of playing the Scandinavian, because a lot of the top gems who are playing it are players like Grishuk, Esipenko, and a few others as well. So, kind of like Russian gems. And that is to play the move of knight bd7. And the idea of knight bd7 is that you're not running into the doubled pawns or, losing time with your queen, but you're just able to take back with the knight instead. So it's a way of playing that has a bit less fury than, the main line of the old main line, but still gives you some interesting positions and some decent scope to outplay the opponent, as it were. Now, the sixth way of playing the Scandinavian is a way that is actually I covered quite a bit already in my video on this black opening destroys players below 2200, where I recommended the Raprincev Scandinavian, with knight c6, just going for this up with long castles, e5, and just throwing everything we have at the d4 pawn. So that's way 6, and if you want to attack your opponent and you don't mind taking a little bit of risk to maximize your chance of winning quickly or getting a big advantage quickly out of the opening, then this is definitely one I can recommend, as I have done before. Way 7 is one that you might not have seen before. It's one I only saw very recently myself, but it's to play a move like g6 and sort of go for this Grunfeld style approach. It's been mostly played by Chinese GMs so far among strong players, but definitely one that you may like to explore in your own time. I do also touch on it on my course as it so happens, but not as my main recommendation. Now, what if they play a little bit differently? What if they don't play knight f3 and they play the move of bishop to c4 instead, for example? Well, in that case, you can stick to way 6 and you can play knight c6, which I've covered in a couple of blog posts of mine and videos recently. But you can also play it a ninth way that sort of takes advantage of the fact I haven't played knight f3 yet. And you can play this move of bishop g4, just trying to provoke either a weakening move or a self-pin of the knight. Again, it's something I cover a lot more deeply in my Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025 course, but just giving you a little bit of a tip so you know what to do if they don't play the automatic knight f3. The 10th way of playing the Scandinavian, and it's funny because I actually recorded a video on this for my students earlier today, is the approach with playing c6 and actually delaying the development of knight f6 and kind of developing the queenside first. No, I do think this move order is probably not that great, even though Nakamura has played it quite a bit in recent online games. Because a lot of time you'll have to play knight f6 and transpose back into the old main line that we just looked at anyway. So you don't really get that much value out of this move order. Unless, your opponent just gets really confused and thrown off. But I think it's not the most likely. But that covers the different ways to play queen a5. And we saw there are actually no less than 8 different ways to play queen a5. So it's something you really could play just for your whole life, just to move queen a5, weaving back and forth between the different variations, and that would probably serve you quite well in practice. Because even if your opponent did prepare for it, you would still have a lot more experience and familiarity with the arising middle games and end games than your opponent would. That being said, I do want to show you some other ways to play the Scandinavian that don't involve the move queen a5, such as the move of queen d6, the Bronstein-Tiviakov's style variation. Now, the 11th way of playing the Scandinavian is to, after knight f6, knight f3, to play the move of c6, and basically, go for moves like bishop g4, bishop f5, and just play a very solid setup. And if your opponent just plays natural developing moves, that will give you a pretty good position out of the opening. In fact, the original video I had planned was going to be to actually go really deep into this and show you 10 different games by one of the leading experts, in fact, the leading expert of the Queen E6 Scandinavian from Black's point of view. Unfortunately, my throat got a little bit sore today, so I just am doing a bit of a shorter video. So you still get the value, so still get see different ways to play Scandinavian, but letting you know I do have some deeper content coming up on this C6 move, because I do have a little bit of a soft spot for it, you could say. But there are also a lot of other ways to play this Queen D6 Scandinavian as well. The 12th way is to play the move of A6, and this is actually his approach that was a little bit trendy in the early to mid 2000s, because it's very, very flexible. You can either go for like a fianchetto and try to play c5 and hit back in the center, or you can play moves like knight c6 and bishop g4 and just put a lot of pressure against the d4 pawn. And there's even a few other ways you can play it, like recently some strong players experimented with putting a bishop on f5 or playing pawn to g6, so even in here, there are kind of a lot of subways, as I like to call it, to play this system and make it your own. The 13th way here is to... It's funny because I kind of showed this idea a little bit, but it's to play the move of knight c6, which I like to call the Dubov variation after a game I showed in one of my earlier videos, Top 10 Crushing Scandinavian Wins, which I'll put up there as well in the suggested videos if you want to check that out. But in that video, I kind of showed a very nice win with this move by Dubov against Karyakin, where in just 13 moves, Dubov basically won a piece against a World Championship finalist, which speaks for itself for the practical strength of this system and how tricky and trappy it can be for white. But also a final way I want to share is the move of g6. This is kind of the 14th way of playing it, where you can kind of go for, kingside fianchetto, hit back their center later, and just have good counterplay against the d-pawn. Because if you are able to trade off their central d-pawn for your c-pawn, you just get this, queenside majority style structure where you just have, no weaknesses, and you have a very healthy position with no bad pieces. So those are some of the different ways to play queen d6. It is true there is also the move order of c6 and bishop g4 that Tivyakov likes to play as a surprise weapon against low-rate players. This was actually my original recommendation in my original Play the Strongest Scandinavian course, but these four other ways I just showed you, I'm also covering in the Play the Strongest Scandinavian 2025 as well, just so you can see all the different ways to play Queen d6 and ultimately pick the one that appeals the most to you. And now with this, we start to move on to some more of the kind of relative sidelines. So the move Queen d8 is actually the most common one at lower levels of play, like in online chess. But as we'll see here, it's actually not that bad of a move necessarily, that there are different ways to play this and get a playable position out of the opening. Now, when I was a junior about 20 years ago and I first started playing the Scandinavian, I was inspired by an article in Secrets of Opening Surprises, this series by New in Chess, where there was an article on how to play the Scandinavian with the move of c6. And there's sort of a fun little wrinkle where we're actually not going to be playing it with bishop f5, but actually going to be playing it more with the move b5 and playing it in a kind of Moran style sort of play, with going for the c5 break later. That is something I do cover, by the way, in Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025, where I share a bit more of my personal experiences and what I've learned since I was playing this line as an 1800 player 20 years ago. But there are also other ways to play this as well. Also the move of Bishop G4 is actually the one that's kind of the trendy one these days, where you sort of recycle the bishop for the knight if you need to, and just build a really solid structure. Move C6 and E6 where you haven't shut in the bishop. So that's the 16th way, and if you're looking for a way to start playing the Scandinavian, without needing to know much theory, just focusing more on how to play the middle games, this is an approach that I think can appeal to those more kind of solid, strategic, less theoretical sort of players. And has been recommended also by other big content creators like John Bartholomew, for example, recommends this Bishop G4 approach. So if it looks familiar to you, that might be the reason why. Also, another approach that's a bit more creative is the move of E6. And I kind of discovered this one a little bit by accident because there were a lot of like low rate players who kept playing this E6 move against me. And even though I felt, okay, surely this move can't be that good, was my initial thought. But it actually turns out it's not that bad for black. That even if white plays all the best moves, white only seems to get, like a small to moderate kind of advantage out of the opening. And black can kind of play the first 10 to 15 moves just as a system opening, just getting quite decent play. So this one of these systems has been played by a few grandmasters recently and can be quite a nice weapon for, for faster time controls like Blitz and Rapid, in my opinion. Also, the final way I'll mention, actually not the final way, but the penultimate way of playing this Queen D8 system is to play the move G6, and this approach is favored by Duda, where you just go for the Fianchetto and then sort of build up this kind of setup on the queen side, like B6, bishop E7, knight C6, that kind of thing, if they castle short. This approach is one that was actually my original recommendation within Queen D8 in my original Play the Strongest Scandinavian course. Now, in 2025, I've subsequently developed like a lot of other ways to play this opening that I like that I just showed you just before. And there's also one other way to play Queen D8 I do want to mention. This one I'm going to call way sort of like 15, but a different way to play way 15, where if you do want to play the bishop f5 set, you can play it with a delayed knight to f6. So if they do play knight e5, you have moves like knight d7, where you can sort of harass their knights. Now, it is true that objectively speaking, this specialty of Le Tun Min, the Vietnamese grandmaster, wonderful time on chess.com, if white is very well prepared for it, it is true they get a big advantage out of the opening, which is why it wouldn't be one of my main recommendations. But it is sort of a lower theory way to play way 15 if you are so inclined. Again, one of those subways as it happens. Now, just to show a few other ways, and these are kind of more of the fringe sort of options I'm about to show you, but if you do want to just avoid theory and just play like a very lazy Scandinavian, like anti-theory style, the move Queen e5 is actually a very interesting one, and there's in fact two different ways in which you can play it. The old school way of playing this line, which technically is known as the Patsa variation, but maybe should be called the Shimanov variation, but we'll get to that in a moment. The Patsa variation way is to play c6, and you're kind of saying that, okay, I've played the move of queen, as if I played queen a5, queen c7, but where white's bishop to b2 move is also not the most active, and, black can end up developing getting a solid position if white doesn't play somewhat directly. Now, it is true, white does get a big advantage here if they do play all the best moves, but it's something I do touch on in my course, play the strongest Scandinavian in 2025. But my main recommendation with Queen e5 there is actually to move Bishop g4, which is in fact the Shimanov Scandinavian. And the idea of it is you just trade off the light squared bishops and then play Queen a5. And then you just kind of develop fairly quietly, like just put the knights out, rook on d8 in the middle game to pressure the d4 pawn. And yeah, if white plays perfectly, they do get a pretty nice advantage here. But I'd say that this is not considerably worse than the other ways of playing the Scandinavian. And it has virtually no fury. Like, virtually all the fury at this point are games played by the US Grandmaster Alexander Shimanov, who has actually beaten Fabiano Caruana twice, in fact, with this opening. Yeah, maybe I'll even cover that in a later YouTube video. It does sound like a pretty good topic, don't you think? Let me know in the comments below if you would like me to show you that at some point, how Shimanov beat Caruana twice with the Shimanov Scandinavian. But yeah, there's also a few other options I want to mention, just a few kind of bonus ways just to kind of round off the video. So the move of Queen e6 I've kind of called Carlsen's Troll Scandinavian. This is way 21, but it is something that I have played in some online games myself, because most people don't know to play Knight f3, and they just all let you, get the sort of attack on their bishop with quite, creative and interesting play, where, white has to think on their own very early, which means they will often make mistakes. So that's kind of a way just to avoid the fury. Also another way in which you can play this system, if they do play Knight f3, you may want to adapt your setup a little bit and play to move Bishop g4 and go for the setup I kind of showed with way 1 and in that video of Destroy white players below 200 with with black. Well, this kind of sub is really what you need to kind of play if they play Knight f3, if you do want to get a good position out of the opening. But just to round it off, yeah, it's a few other ways to play it within Knight f6. After c4 here, you kind of have two ways to play, where you can either go c6 if you're happy just to, transpose into a pawn of Botvinnik Karakan, or if you do want to play it more independently, the independent way 23, is the Icelandic gambit with e6, which maybe doesn't have quite as strong a reputation as c6, but does still give quite playable chances. As I mentioned in my video, my favorite gambit versus e4, where I talked a bit more about it. And the final two ways I will share is that if you really love to play the Danish gambit as white, with like e4, e5, and this sort of thing, then way 24 of playing a Danish gambit with tempo less might be appealing to you. And I will admit, I think this gambit is not entirely sound, and I probably wouldn't recommend it against master opposition. But if you're looking for a fun kind of bullet blitz weapon just to avoid fury and just get a fun attacking game, then this can be a way of doing so. And the final bonus way I'm going to share is if they do play knight c3, like originally I had recommend the move d4 in my Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025 course. But I also decided to update and show like a low fury way of playing knight f6 and just going for an improved version of the Korchnoi Karakan, where we didn't have to play the move of c6 as such. So that's kind of the 25th bonus way that I want to share. So there you have it. You now know the 25 different ways of playing the Scandinavian. And I realized there were a few other ways that kind of I didn't sort of mention just because either I felt that they were, either a bit too obscure or just a bit too unsound to really mention here. But you can see from this video there are a lot of different ways to play the Scandinavian. It's very easy to try different ones and find the one that really suits you the very best. And also means if you get sick of playing the Scandinavian one way, you can always play it a slightly different way and still use that experience with the positions, because, it's only one structure really have to learn how to play, and after that you have a system that's basically sets you up for life. So yeah, you can sort of feel my passion for the Scandinavian. Do let me know in the comments below. What was your favorite way that I shared? What's your favorite way of playing the Scandinavian? Do let me know that in the comments below. And also, if this has inspired you to take your understanding of the Scandinavian to next level, if you do want to be in a situation where you just never have to fear the move e4 ever again, where you can continually face that move with confidence, know what you're doing much better than the opponents, and ultimately get better results against e4 and the improvement that you're after, then do make sure to check out my link in the description below to my course Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025. All the lines that I've shown you here are lines I do actually cover in that course, so I do go a lot deeper than what we've seen here with this little overview. But yeah, look forward to seeing you in the next video, and until then, take care.